Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, Tome 14, Betrayal, and the Knight's new story, Nothing But Darkness. Oh boy, this was always going to be an interesting one. We've never had a tome for a new killer this soon after they came out, in that character's own mid-chapter patch no less. The closest we've ever had to this before is the All-Kill tome Crescendo, which came 6 months after the release of Trickster and Yunjin. At the time, Behaviour were aggressively confident that All-Kill was going to be a beloved chapter, and pulled out all the stops to milk the K-pop audience for all they were worth. They worked with a BTS producer on the chapter's design, they took on a whole new anime-esque art style for promotional animations for the chapter, and Trickster got a windfall of buffs and add-on changes not long after his release to try to keep him relevant and keep people interested after he came out pretty weak. Wow, I wonder where all the effort, money and time they didn't put into Twins went. The point I'm trying to make here is that Fortune Fog was released with that same confidence as All-Kill. Between Vittorio getting the Thirst Trap shirtless skin on release, and getting 3 new outfits this mid-chapter, the Knight getting showered with buffs just like Trickster was, and now this tome, suggests to me that the devs were sure his chapter was going to be a hit, and it just kind of wasn't. Despite Tarosh having his fair share of dedicated players, he's not what you'd call popular. And while Twitter was aflame with people demanding to eat their dinner off Vittorio's abs, it didn't seem to translate into many people playing him beyond the first week or two. Those new Fangling cosmetics aren't repeating themselves after all. Nevertheless, Tome 14, Misplaced Confidence, is here now. And regardless of what brought us here, it's time to look at the stories we got and give them a fair shout. Today we're starting out with a Knight story, Nothing But Darkness. And we'll do Vittorio and Maurice in the near future. In order to properly evaluate the Knight's tome story, we need to look first at the kind of character his base lore indicates he already was, and then look at how the tome treats that character. If you want to hear out my full thoughts on the Knight's base lore, I did a full video on it when he came out. But for the sakes of completeness, and in case you've forgotten, I'm going to do a quick recap. Tarosh Korvach was born in 14th century Hungary, and his village was ransacked and put to the sword before he was taken as a slave to the Guardia Compagna mercenary band. After befriending a group of fellow slaves, Tarosh soon became renowned for his battle prowess and earned the knighthood and his freedom. Now working as a mercenary, he took up work for Vittorio Toscano of Portoscuro, as he hunted for the Lapis Paradisus, an ancient artifact that opened a gateway to another world. Nope, not that one. When Tarosh was sent to retrieve it, he seized the opportunity and the Lapis Paradisus for himself, taking Vittorio prisoner and claiming his lands and wealth. With Vittorio locked in one of his own dungeons, Tarosh attempted to extract Vittorio's knowledge of the Lapis Paradisus by force, torturing the citizenry of Portoscuro and ransacking the city. It was only when the neighbouring lords led armies to Portoscuro's gates and Vittorio vanished mysteriously from his cell that Tarosh and his comrades-in-arms took up the fight once more, and in the swirling melee of bloody combat, the entity claimed Tarosh and the Guardia Compagna for its own. Just like a lot of newer killers, this long and exhaustive story, which partially overlaps with Vittorio's, covers pretty much all of Tarosh's life, from his youth as a captive and slave to his taking by the entity. This meant when his tome came around, we didn't really know what to expect. There wasn't really a gap in his life that Tome looked ready to fill, and because of the story's extraordinary breadth, it meant there was a ton of potential areas the story could have fleshed out. Nothing But Darkness is a very peculiar story because despite having Tarosh's entire life already written to draw from for inspiration, it doesn't really choose to develop him as a person or explore any particular part of his life in a great deal of focus. This is quite a break from tradition. Typically a tome zooms in on a particular section of a character's life to form a self-contained narrative. This can be a part that already exists, like the Hillbillies' breakout in A Man Named Boy, or a whole new chunk of story, like Wraith's Algebra of Infinite Night. Nothing But Darkness takes a slightly different approach, focusing less on the details in favour of a more sweeping story that covers more of Tarosh's life, starting in his childhood just like his base lore does, and continuing to cover his taking of the Lapis Paradisus and then the conquest of Port Oscuro. Straight away, I'm not the biggest fan of this. A tome is our chance to really get knuckle deep into a character and learn more about them and their relationships. Sometimes this broader stroke really works, especially if the character is old and poorly established in the base lore. Trapper, for example, had his tome handled similarly, as it collects a series of events throughout his life. But it works for him because his character is so dated that building him effectively from scratch is kind of necessary. Tarosh is the product of modern DBD storytelling. We can afford to do something deeper and more exciting with the character than that. To turn Tarosh's tome into effectively a recap of his base lore without delving into his character in a novel way feels like such a waste, especially since there was a really easy way they could have done just that. Tarosh's guards, Durkos the assassin, Sander the Carnifex, and Alejandro the jailer are characters that have so much potential for interesting storytelling and are almost completely ignored in the base lore. A relationship tome is a tried and tested formula for killers with an established relationship as a core part of their backstory. Legion did it, Twins did it amazingly and possibly the best tome story ever written, and Tarosh getting a tome displaying and exploring that relationship with the Guardia Compagna felt like an easier slam dunk than the LA Lakers playing as a team of 3-year-olds on roller skates. Imagine, if you will, a story expanding on this section of Tarosh's lore, where he lays waste to the former slave owners and reunites with his comrades in arms before they take the fight back to Port Oscuro. That would have been a great way to explore his relationship with them that we just never got in the base lore. Like, the fact that the guards get more characterization in Tarosh's Mori than they do in both the Knight stories combined should really be considered a crime, because it's such a massive missed opportunity. But before we continue, here's one opportunity you don't want to miss. It's no secret that Dead by Daylight solo queue players aren't the smartest tools in the shed, but this channel's new partner GamerLink is out to mend the damage that one Nikayla did to your psyche and bring players together. GamerLink is an app that lets you find players to group up with so you can rally your own Guardia Compagna to strike back against the pretender lords who hold society in their death grips. Or just, do gens with. Maybe get a sick beamer save, I don't know. You can filter by region, playstyle, skill level, communicative preferences, and by casual or competitive, so it's easy to find teammates who are right for you. And it isn't just Dead by Daylight. With support for over 350 games, it's never been easier to find teammates for Evil Dead, Overwatch, or many of the other games ported by GamerLink that don't make me want to microwave my own head. It's free to sign up on Android and iOS, and if you do, be sure to use my link in the description and in the pinned comment to get you started. Now, back to the Knight's lore. So, yeah, the Knight's tome story is too broad and unfocused to be a proper character story. The guards are almost completely ignored, so it can't be a relationship story. And it covers events we've already seen, so it's not a hidden secrets and plot-heavy story either. So what is it? I'd argue it's a theme story that mostly justifies its own existence by hammering a certain theme or idea into the reader's head so strongly that blood starts to leak out of it while you sleep, like Madison in Malignant. And that theme is, Jesus Christ, medieval times were horrible to live in. This is a trope as old as time, that the medieval era was this cruel, harsh and filthy time, where lords with gout would have you flayed in public for farting in their general direction, and your average peasant died at 25 with rotten teeth in a hut made of sticks and human feces. How true this is to real-life history depends on a variety of factors, such as exact time period, region, and social class. While people and cities were definitely at their filthiest during the Renaissance and early modern periods, Tarosh's lore affirms that this late medieval world is one full of brutality, squalor, and filth. This horribleness is established at the start, where Tarosh's village is ransacked by knights by the order of their lord. And far from a fairy story where a brave hero or band of well-meaning wandering rogues protects the people and saves the day, Tarosh's mother leads her son to commit suicide instead of leaving him at the hands of the invaders. This is an even bigger deal than it would be today because of the attitude to suicide across Europe at the time. Back then, suicide was seen as depriving your lord of his possession of you and as a sin on par with murder. The bodies of suicide victims were frequently desecrated, their property seized by the local lord or monarch, and in the 6th century the Catholic Church officially decreed suicide as too dire a sin to permit the victim their last funeral rites, meaning they were effectively barred from heaven and condemned to hell. Back in those days, when God was as much a fact of life as the tides in the moon, this was a massive deal, and Tarash's mother chose to potentially send her and her son's souls to hell for an eternity of torment because the alternative was staying on this earth and letting the knights have their way with them. That decision by her presents the world of Tarash's story as one of unbelievable suffering, literally hell on earth, and Tarash's mother was simply offering him the last gift she could. The only gift that really matters in the end. A good death. Yeah, if there's one thing you can say about the story aptly named Nothing But Darkness, it's that it's pretty depressing. Almost everybody is either suffering or inflicting suffering at basically all times. Any moments of decency, honour and altruism are immediately pushed aside by the story, and it's narrated by a main character who's jaded and nihilistic to the point of sadism and psychopathy. To help you understand why I think this is so interesting, I'm going to need to explain to you the concept of grimdark. Grimdark is kind of a subgenre, kind of a writing style that you'll see in speculative fiction or dark fantasy that presents a world so devoid of virtue or morality that doing the right thing isn't just futile, but is pretty much impossible within the confines of the setting. Grimdark as a term comes from the tagline of the tabletop wargame Warhammer 40,000. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The setting of Warhammer is famous for being extremely dark and morbid, with pretty much every faction that's duking it out in the galaxy being easily considered the villains in any other sci-fi setting. It says a lot that the rootable human faction at the centre of the marketing is a theocratic fascist empire built on the back of preteen boys, genetically engineered into indoctrinated super soldiers, and ruled by a near-dead dictator who's been locked suffering in the moments of his death for 10,000 years, worshipped as a god against his wishes, and kept alive by a failing life support machine powered by the souls of 1,000 innocent sacrifices every single day. In any other sci-fi world, these guys are the villains, but in Warhammer they're presented as kind of a necessary evil for humanity's survival in the setting. While there is significant overlap between grimdark and horror, there's a distinct difference which applies, I think, to the Knight's Tome story. Horror is all about theme. Whether it's about exploring dark themes that other media wouldn't let you, like torture, addiction and the value of life in Saw, or exploring more approachable themes through a darker lens, like A Nightmare on Elm Street examining growing up and coming of age by using a sadistic child murderer who kills you in your dreams. What can really set grimdark apart from just plain old sci-fi horror or horror fantasy is the tone. It's not enough for grimdark to simply have dark content, but it has to explicitly reject or refute any notions of hope, virtue or altruism. For a genre heavy on dark themes, horror has a surprising amount of hope and levity in it a lot of the time. Countless horror stories end with the virtuous final girl triumphing to live another day, while evil slinks off into the darkness and licks its wounds. It never dies though, gotta have that sequel, right? And the popular horror comedy subgenre is proof that a competent horror movie doesn't need to take itself entirely seriously. Grimdark, on the other hand, kind of does need to take itself seriously to function, and by definition cannot have a figure of outright hope to win the day. Well, Warhammer was originally meant to be a satire of Thatcherite Britain and of fascism in general, but as the setting became more fleshed out and more, well, grimdark, it took itself more seriously and its role as a piece of satire diminished considerably. This, to me, affirms the Knight's Tome story and the Night in Forge and Fog as a whole as textbook grimdark. The whole story is totally devoid of hope, and any attempts to do the right thing are fruitless and just end up causing more death and tragedy. The young warriors who stand up against Tarosh when he attempts to seize the stone are dispatched swiftly and brutally with no fanfare and no impact whatsoever. and Vittorio's adherence to his virtues and moral code only cause him and everyone around him to suffer even more. This even applies to the wider narrative beyond this particular tome. In Vittorio's base lore, we learn the paradise he was seeking was the realm of the entity all along, and thus even his ultimate dream of a world free of violence and cruelty was just another fantasy. Fanatics of grimdark stories and literature will often cite these sorts of works as being more realistic than more optimistic stories, but it's important to remember that grimdark fiction is no more realistic than, say, supernatural horror. Because a core defining trait of grimdark is exaggeration. Let's use our example of Warhammer 40k again. Much of the universe's grimdarkness comes from stuff that's blatantly unrealistic and doesn't pretend to be realistic in the first place. The mass sacrifice of 1,000 souls a day, for example, is because of these psychic powers and eldritch gods of chaos that exist in the setting, and humanity has been stuck in 10 millennia of mass institutional decay because of management and xenophobia bordering on the suicidal. These things may have justifications in universe, but that doesn't make them realistic. And the same goes for many elements of the Night story and design. Look at Tarosh's internal monologue in this story. It's unashamedly over the top in its grimdarkness, and I kinda love it for that. Find another way? Why? So Toscano can sleep at night? So he can waste more of his time with his foolish notions of right and wrong, of good and evil, of noble and barbaric. Toscano's entire fortune was secured with violence and slaughter, justified by highly imaginative codes and laws. His fortune was secured with nothing but darkness. Tarosh grinds his teeth as disgust darkens towards hate. And he feels something else. He feels Toscano doesn't deserve the spoils of his ancestors, or his relics, or this ancient stone that will somehow open a gateway to a world untainted by violence. He's a fool if he believes such a thing. No such place exists. And if such a place did exist, he would want nothing to do with it. He sighs and scrunches his fist. He wants to crush him like a maggot. Of all the lords he served, this one he hates the most. Holy shit, the edge on this man could cut a cake. Every single interaction Tarosh has with anyone else is so unlike how a normal person would act, which spins around to the absurd when you realise that Vittorio, the intellectual pacifist, hired this clearly unstable murderous lunatic as his bodyguard and enforcer. The story disposes of any realism, so that Vittorio's role as a symbol of virtue and goodness can be extinguished by Tarosh. And the reason I think this is a stylistic choice and not just bad writing is because it's in keeping with what's already established about the character. The first place we can look to see this is his character design. The armour is absolutely over the top, and dispenses with any realism to make him look dour and intimidating. The most obvious style choice of note is the helmet with the hair coming out of the eye slits. That helm design would almost certainly prevent you from seeing anything, especially when these slits are full of hair, and such an impractical design would not suit a practical and experienced warrior like Tarosh. Same goes for the shoulder spikes, the chain links around his chest and arms, and the poorly maintained sword. But we live with it, because it's somewhat justified in universe on account of him making his own armour, so a non-standard design does make sense, and more importantly, it's a design choice that looks badass and makes him appear intimidating. This extends to the guards too. They don't look like real people and clearly don't even try to. They're obviously stylized with weaponry and visual and sound designs that evoke their loose character archetypes and therefore gameplay functions. This is not unique to Tarosh per se, but I'd say he's probably the most obvious example of this in the whole of DBD's cast. That same grotesque and grimy stylization extends to the language and imagery used in the Tome story. Tarosh's monologue to Vittorio about his village being put to the sword is obviously meant to deflate Vittorio's righteousness. But if we're talking strictly of historical accuracy, it would be very unlikely that this would have happened during Tarosh's childhood in Hungary. Assuming Tarosh was born about the same kind of time as Vittorio was, that would put his childhood in about the 1350s during the reign of King Charles I, and his centralisation of local lords under the crown made Hungary the collectively safest it had ever been up to that point. By centering the country's power structure around himself, King Charles commanded the loyalty of many noble families who he pleased or even instituted during his reign, which left the kingdom relatively safe from internal strife during that time, meaning it's unlikely that any Hungarian lords would just send an army of knights to wipe out a village for no real reason. Sure, it could have been Italian knights ended up torturing the village, but Italy was a decent way from Hungary, and at the time Italy was a collection of independent warring city-states anyway. Why send a raiding party all the way across the Alps to a random Hungarian village to take slaves when you could just fight each other instead? This extends Tadosh's expedition into the catacombs of Sintra to retrieve the Lapis Paradisus. All the death traps and bottomless pits he has to jump to retrieve the stone are very Indiana Jones, but that's not how real temples were ever built anywhere in the world. Especially not in Western Europe, where revered relics are more likely to be put on display in a cathedral or church to essentially flex on the faithful than be squirreled away where nobody can look at them. But the notion of the forbidden relic locked away because humans can't be trusted with it, and Tadosh literally bathing himself in the darkness to retrieve it despite the perils, creates an exciting and thematic story, and makes his return and subsequent takeover appropriately fill the reader with dread. So we overlook the lack of realism because it fits the tone and theme of the story. That's what I mean when I call Nothing But Darkness a theme story. It doesn't attempt to expand the character of Tadosh Kovacs or the relationship he has in any interesting ways, at least none that the base lore doesn't already do more succinctly. But what it does do is paint a picture of a world that's effectively hell on earth, and illustrates Tadosh's place in it as a conscious and willing participant in that world's way of life. Just like any other piece of grimdark storytelling, it dispenses with all notions of realism and groundedness and subtlety in favour of just trying to make you miserable, and project an image of a world that's pretty much as fatalistic as Tadosh sees it. And this is where I don't know whether or not to recommend this story to you, because more than any other story I've ever read from Behaviour, it's fair to say your mileage may vary on this one. If you take DBD's characters seriously and read lore to learn more about your favourite characters, this tome story honestly isn't for you. Everything you need to know about Tadosh is already in his base lore. This story doesn't add anything to that, and you're better off just, reading that. Or reading any of the other tome stories for other characters that work more effectively as character studies. The new Ghostface and Michaela stories, for example, from the last tome, give them a read, they are absolute bangers. I say that, and yet I don't regret reading Nothing But Darkness, because despite it not really giving me anything I didn't have before, I still had a good time reading it. It was still fun as just something to read. And if you're someone who likes the experience of reading, of drinking in the words on a page and painting a picture with it in your mind, this story might just be right up your alley. Nothing But Darkness is all style, no substance, but in the best possible way. And if that over-the-top grimdark edginess is a style that suits you, then you'll probably have some fun with it. And at the end of the day, isn't that the point of a story? To just be able to escape. To step out of this mundane world of takeaway pizzas and overdrafts and washing up, and go somewhere that can never exist. The world of Nothing But Darkness, the world of the Forge and Fog chapter as a whole, might be grim, dark and bloody, but as a visitor, it's a fine place to be. Thank you for watching this video on the Knight's Tome story. I didn't know what to expect, and truth be told, I was a little disappointed, but still like what we got. But what do you think? If you want to read the full story for yourself for the Knight, Vittorio and the Maurice story, the link to it is in the description. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe if you're interested in more lore content, plus some other slightly things I've got planned for February. Evil Dead just had a pretty significant content and balance update, which I'll be covering in my next video. But I have so much cool stuff planned for this month, I cannot wait to show you. And patrons get to see it earlier than everybody else. So if you're interested in joining the Patreon to get early access, an invite into the Patreon exclusive Discord chat, and some other perks as well, then that's also in the description. Don't feel pressured to, but if you're of course interested in helping to keep things running over here. And before we go, thanks to the channel's brand new partner, GamerLink. Once again, if you're interested in meeting teammates and maybe even friends, be sure to check out my download link for Android or iOS in the description and in the pinned comment. So, thank you so much for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.